Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we discuss and examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Patrick Wood, an author and tireless researcher who is going to be discussing the subject of technocracy. Patrick has penned 2 books on the subject, Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation, and also Technocracy, the Hard Road to World Order. And he also knows a fair bit about the Trilateral Commission, having co-authored 2 books, Trilaterals over Washington in the 70s with Anthony Sutton. Patrick, thank you for taking the time to join me today, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Nigel. When you said tireless, did you mean tired?
I hope it's not starting to wear like that, Patrick. I do hope, but you could be forgiven after these decades.
Oh my,
Patrick. Perhaps we could start, properly by defining our terms, of course, and defining this thing called technocracy. But maybe first you could just give a very brief introduction as to how you became interested in this subject, which seems to be a big dot joining exercise and enabling people to see a bigger picture.
Right. In the 1970s, there was an organization started in New York City called the Trilateral Commission. It was a global organization, had members in Europe and Japan and North America. And the idea was to create what they called a new international economic order. Now, that's an odd term, but this phrase was all over the literature. They wanted to promote interdependence amongst nations so that everybody would be a happy little family. And they termed themselves as being the end run around national sovereignty. And it wasn't just our national sovereignty, it was the national sovereignty of every nation on earth. We didn't realize that at the time exactly. But, as time went on, we had most of it in hand back then. I dug up an old article from Forbes magazine. Actually, a reader sent me the copy of it. And I was just kind of remembering, and I was amazed at how clearly we articulated this new international economic order and what the dangers were. What I didn't recognize at the time, and neither did Sutton, was that they really meant new. The word new is like, well, we thought maybe they're just going to kind of rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic and they would game the slot machine to always pay off for them. And of course they did that, but that's not what the word new meant. And so when I discovered historic technocracy in about 12, 13 years ago now, I realized that I read on their own documentation that technocracy was a replacement economic system for capitalism and free market economics. It was designed in the 1930s by prominent scientists and engineers in New York City at Columbia University. And when they said new, they meant new. They created this from scratch as a resource-based economic system, not based on supply and demand and currency like we understand currency today, but rather to be a micromanaged, controlled system, economic system, where all consumption and all production is controlled by their quote-unquote science or their scientific approach. And they felt like this was so advanced and so good that they didn't have any need for political systems whatsoever. So they promoted getting rid of all parliaments and congresses and executive agencies like we have. I know that sounds kind of far out, but this is what they actually said. Well, when I discovered historic technocracy, and I realized from an economic point of view, it was the only newly designed economic system in the history of the world. Nobody has ever made that claim in history. Well, we've designed a new economic system. So, okay, there's the word new, and there's the word new from the 1970s. I thought, holy crud, could this be possible? Could it be that they were talking about technocracy back in 1973 when David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski got together to create this supranational organization that intended to reform the entire global economic system? And the answer was yes.
Yeah.
It was unmistakable. As I researched both of them side by side again, I kind of had to do it all from scratch, from the ground up. I did. I was too important not to. This is exactly what the Trilateral Commission had in mind way back then, and it has matured over the last several decades to what we have today. And it's interesting, just in kind of hindsight, that back in the 70s, most of these people in the Trilateral Commission kind of hid out behind the scenes. They didn't want the public really to know what they were doing. It's not that they were secret, but they took efforts to obscure what they were doing and to confuse people like us who were trying to analyze it. And so they stayed in the background for the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But starting in the year 2000, they began to come out of the woodwork a little bit more, pointedly. Until today, we have the same crowd operating through the auspices, for instance, of the World Economic Forum, which has promised the Great Reset. Not only of society and economic structure, but also of the human condition as well. So now these same oligarchs, if you will, have found no reason to hide out in the shadows anymore. They're in the wide open clear for everybody to see videos, articles, speaking engagements. Nothing is really held back from view right now, because I believe they have finally come so close to their end game that they are unafraid of the people finding out what they're doing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it seems that way. I mean, perhaps we can bring in things like Agenda 21 as we go along. There's much to discuss here, but clearly in the current context of the alleged climate emergency and the alleged pandemic narrative, we've got two very important threads that both require a change to the way we live. They both demand radical changes to which technocracy is trying to position itself. I suppose that might be the best way to say it, as the answer. So when you look around today and in the context of this, alleged medical situation that's going on, do you see this sort of manifestation, a sort of coup d'etat for the technocrats?
I do, and I've written that and spoken about it quite extensively, actually, ever since the World Health Organization declared the pandemic. And it was January 2020, I think it was January 30, that they made the formal declaration that we were facing a pandemic. I realized immediately that the same people who had promoted climate alarmism previously, in Europe and all around the world, really, through universities, through the United Nations, through people like what was I can't remember the young lady's name that was making a fool of herself at the United Nations. But anyway, the climate alarmism was promoted by these crazy utopianists through the view of the United Nations. The same people were promoting and doing all the stuff around COVID back then, the pandemic. Same people. Yeah. They were using the same crackpot computer models to create these dire forecasts for the future, and they pumped it like crazy. My thought at the time was the reason that they had failed or they viewed their failure with climate alarmism. They couldn't get the people to do anything about it. The people were just resistant. And the reason was they could not pump the fear engine in society because there was no dead bodies. Yeah. There were polar bears. They said they were dying, but turns out they weren't dying. They were doing just fine.
They did do a very good job of making sure that premise is almost universally accepted, though. You'd be hard put, or I find I'm hard put, to find anyone who would challenge the climate emergency narrative. So they did a good job there.
Yes, they did.
But Patrick, maybe I could just interrupt you before we go too much further. Can we define technocracy? And I know you like to go back to the technocrats' original definition. Perhaps we could lay that out so people, can get a clearer idea of what we're talking about.
I'll summarize it quickly for you. The first thing is they call it the science of social engineering. And that's exactly what they meant. Engineer, because they were science engineers after all. Of course, they would want to engineer society, but that's a scary term today, the science of social engineering. We see this now everywhere, though. We see it throughout social media, through the big tech companies like Google and fintech companies, the new financial companies that are kind of trying to rule everything now. So that was the first major premise that they made. Secondly, they talked about controlling all production and all consumption. That is, they would control the natural resources that go into making things that come out of the earth primarily. Well, actually all out of the earth, maybe some out of the atmosphere. But they wanted to control all resources in the system, allocate those very carefully to the manufacturers to produce what they were authorized to produce. And therefore, by the time it got to consumers, they were going to micromanage what the consumers, that's people, were able and authorized to consume. That was it in a nutshell. It was very autocratic. It was very scientific dictatorship-like. And there was a book, by the way, that came out in 1932 when technocracy was created at Columbia University by a very well-known Brit by the name of Aldous Huxley. That book was titled Brave New World. And I'm thoroughly convinced after doing a little bit of research on this that he was very well aware of what technocracy was, and that he looked into it and said, there's a book in this, and he wrote a book. And if anybody wants to get an idea of where technocracy will take us in kind of a practical sense, go read the book, Brave New World, and you will notice that the people in that technate, if you will, they had no choice about what they did. They just had to do what they were told. And there was no family relationships. There was nobody having babies because falling in love and having babies was illegal. All babies were created in a test tube in an incubator, and they were scientifically engineered to be of a certain intelligence in order to work in a certain position within society. So you had the gammas at the bottom of the pile. They were just the grunt workers that swept the streets and picked up the trash. And you had the alphas at the top of the pile that actually ran the society. And there was no political system whatsoever. There was no sign at all of a political system within the book Brave New World. Now, there have been other writers that have written about dystopia for sure, but I pick on this one in particular because Aldous Huxley was no friend of humanity in one sense, that he went on to be, to found UNESCO. He was very much involved in the United Nations. He was totally involved in the whole sustainable development thing as that went forward. And so I think he was he had something significant to say back then, and he said it, and so we have it today. Yeah. This is technocracy.
So you call it social engineering. I mean, that should be a word that should make people recoil on its own, shouldn't it? The idea of social engineering clearly doesn't involve asking people or allowing people to make their own decisions. It involves steering things towards one particular goal according to one particular group. So that should be alarming on its own. So it sounds as though it's a system for complete control. Would you say that that's fair enough? And
absolutely. You have to, if you understand this from an engineer's mind, which is kind of hard for a lot of people to get inside of an engineer's head, but if you understood it from an engineering point of view, somebody, for instance, built a factory, moving parts, conveyor belts, heaters, whatever. You'd want to put sensors all over that factory to monitor what's going on. So if a heater started to overheat, you could send a technician down to fix it. And if a conveyor belt was running too hot, you knew you had to go down and oil the bearings or whatever. So you'd want to put monitors in place on your factory to keep ahead of the breakdown curve, right? So keep it maintained and working right. I don't have any problem. I don't own a factory, but if I had a factory, I would do the same thing. But when you apply that thinking to all of society, you've got some serious, serious problems that come about with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because people don't like to be monitored. They like their privacy. They don't want to be micromanaged. They don't want to be told, no, you can't step off the curb right there. You can't go across the street or whatever. They want a certain measure of autonomy in society. And this has pretty much been what we've been used to in the Western world, at least, right, for the last 100, 200 years. This is all going away right now, as we know. Everybody can feel the heat of this this scientific dictatorship, if you will, coming down on them. And I know I can only watch from the news what's going on in Great Britain right now with the lockdowns and with the flip-flopping of your politicians over there. And, going from great hope even a couple of years ago before COVID to going to almost total rebellion and despair today because of the lockdowns, because of the tyrannical decisions that government is forcing upon the people. And this is happening globally. I know you could look at Australia, for instance, a great example of tyranny in action right now. Yeah. You can look at Canada, they're right behind it. You can look at, of course, Great Britain and some countries in Europe, and it's coming to America now, too. We're starting to feel the pinch of this scientific dictatorship, and as the vice grip gets tighter on us, as it squeezes us more, personal freedom and liberty is just going out the window.
Absolutely. I mean, this seems like a very important point just to hammer home, because we need to really remind ourselves, don't we, all of us individually, and indeed in conversations with each other, what do we want? We want peace, freedom, and abundance. Most people don't want to be told what to do. They don't want to be monitored, as you've illustrated. People want freedom almost without being able to define it, or without being able to, without being so aware of the prerequisites that enable it, and seeing them actually disappear before our eyes. But I wanted to just talk about the sort of the spin of technocracy for a moment, Patrick, because we do hear the term not on the sort of mainstream news, if you like, but it is out there in the narrative. And there's an idea that technocracy is somehow the solution to a couple of problems that I've determined. And one is failing democracies. Allegedly, democracies are inefficient and they're too corrupt, and democracies aren't working anymore. We need to change that. And then, of course, there's, as we've already alluded to, the climate dimension and the need for sustainable development and for everybody to live, in a different way with less, et cetera, et cetera. So technocracy is very much sort of spun as a solution. Would you think that's fair to say?
It is. And I agree with you. Back when Agenda 21 was put in place in 1992 at Rio de Janeiro, the whole reason that was presented to the public on why that conference was needed was to address the problem of development throughout the world, economic development. And they had all kinds of darts that they would throw, deforestation of Amazon, the rainforest in Brazil, and other, economic things. Oh, this, the world is going to pot. We need to curb development. We need to do something, to take control. Yeah. Well, what they proposed was to solve the development problem was more development. They said, they said, well, we have a development problem, but we're going to fix it by more development, which doesn't make any sense. But this has been the mindset of technocrats forever. Well, forever. I'm going back at least to when the whole thing started, right?
Yeah.
So when you say, well, technology is causing a problem, and I don't care what problem you come up with, but say something has gone screwy, and somebody says, well, this technology just isn't working out for society. A technocrat will stand up and say, well, we can fix that with more technology. This is always what they say.
Yeah, that's
and
nuts,
they've been using this kind of, if you get my overall point here, they've been using this dystopian thought, dialectic thought, that the answer to the problem is more of the problem.
Yes.
And that will fix the problem.
Absolutely, dressing it up as a scientific fix, of course, but we'll come into that. I mean, they also, I've heard Singapore sort of championed as something of a technocracy, but wouldn't you think it's fair to say that China is perhaps more the model that we should look to if we wanted to, aside from reading the book Brave New World, of course, but a glimpse at China? Would you say that how much is that a technocracy these days? How much is that representative of where we could well be going?
Yes. China is a technocracy. I'll say it straight up. This was identified, by the way, not by me, but by Time Magazine, of all people, just after the year 2000, when they when they wrote an article that clearly presented in context that China had morphed into a technocracy. I had to do research on that to find out why. How did that happen? And you won't remember probably that back in the 1970s, when Zbigniew Brzezinski was the national security advisor to our then President Carter, Jimmy Carter, that Zbigniew Brzezinski, being one of the co-founders of the Trilateral Commission, mind you, and the New International Economic Order, etc., he was the guy who single-handedly brought the premier of China to the U.S. and brought China back onto the economic stage. It was Zbigniew Brzezinski who was credited, even today in political science books, as being the hero of the day that foresaw the whatever, blah, 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 that China needed to come back into the world stage. Well, back in 1976, China looked a lot like North Korea looks today. It was economically a train wreck. Nothing worked. They just couldn't get anywhere. They were closed off to the rest of the world. And Brzezinski brought them into the economic fold again. But the question would be, since they knew nothing about economic systems, their communist system had totally failed the people and the nation and everything. The whole system was just a train wreck. Brzezinski did not teach them capitalism and free enterprise. He didn't teach them free market economics. And I have to say this very carefully, if Brzezinski was a technocrat, which I believe firmly he was, he would have taught them technocracy, the principles of technocracy, the science of social engineering, the control over resources and consumption and manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
He would have taught them how to build that kind of society, and that is exactly what he did.
Absolutely, and on perfect foundations, we might observe, because the political structure, clearly people having no freedom already, is the perfect structure, probably I imagine, on which to lay this sort of system, technocratic system. You've described it as a I'm not sure it's fair to say purely economic system, but as an economic system, obviously from the definition of the Technocrat magazine back in 1938, I think it was. But is it, strictly speaking, an economic system? Because it seems that it's designed for complete control, which is inherently political, isn't it? If people are having all of their lives controlled, if their ability to produce, own things, sell things is all controlled, this is under some sort of, it comes under a political umbrella of some sort. Would you not agree? And where I'm going with this is that it seems to me that technocracy, and I'm picking up on a lot of what you have said in other interviews and so forth, it seems that it's ripe to sort of move in when politics is no longer needed. When the people are so enslaved or so caught up in the system, it seems that technocracy can just sort of push politics aside, as you say, do away with all the politicians, and now the prison bars are all in place, the final bars are down, now nobody can really do anything about it, and of course the removal of a political system, a means of appeal, no representative to go to with your problems and your complaints. It seems that it is a political system, but it's ready to sort of throw politics out the window because it doesn't want anyone to have a voice. Is that a fair analysis, do you think?
Well, in China's case, they have perfected rule of the people by algorithm. It isn't necessary for a person to be sitting watching a camera anymore or a screen anymore with his with his finger on the cancel button. It's all done by artificial intelligence and surveillance. They have now 600 million cameras for 1.2 billion people. Mm-hmm. That ought to do it. I would think that's one camera for every two people. They can track everything you do. They know everything that you've done. They know every financial transaction. They know every ticket you've gotten for jaywalking. They know who you're married to. They know who your friends are, who your network is, where you go. All of this is sucked into artificial intelligence systems to figure out if you are behaving according to their science of social engineering. Whatever that model is that they have, it's generally secretive, but the idea, you never see the code, but the idea is if you step out of line according to their narrative, you're going to be punished, and you're going to be punished immediately. It's not going to require an investigation like in World War II when Nazi Germany had the Gestapo or the SS that went around investigating people and had spies and snoops and snitches and all that sort of thing. Today in China, it's all done by algorithm. This is the nirvana, the holy grail of technocracy, is to put those monitoring systems in place and control everybody automatically. Now, you could say, well, so who writes the algorithms? Who writes those AI programs that sets the policies? Well, they're technocrats that do that. There's no political influence here where the people can go to the programmers and say, we'd like to have a system where, we can go to Tiananmen Square on Sunday and have picnics. They throw you out the window. I mean, get out of here. You don't tell us how to program this thing. We know how to program it. There's no recourse for the people whatsoever. If you're caught jaywalking and the camera films you jaywalking and AI determines you jaywalked, you'll get an AI ticket applied to you with a fine that could be taken out of your bank account by the time you get home. And read about it on your local computer that, well, you jaywalked back there and the fine has already been taken out. Shame on you. Do it again. We're going to double the fine.
And social credit scores and things, they're probably all docked and onward ramifications with travel and where you can live and all these sorts of things. Is that right?
Well, totally. I mean, I read a story of a young girl who was a student at university, and I forget if it was Beijing or not, but she was a student at a good university on track. She had good grades, and she did something that ticked off the system. And so the system decided she was not worthy, and her social credit score fell. As a result, she was terminated from her classes at university and told she could no longer be enrolled there. She thought at first, well, that's really strange because, I was doing good and I had really good scores, et cetera, et cetera. And then they told her, or she got a notice from her landlord where she was in a fairly nice apartment, that she would have to move because she wasn't, well, they didn't say that initially, but she did discover then that she was being extricated from society because her social credit score was too low. And if it had been higher, she would have been able to maintain her privileges, but because it was low, she was being cast out. So she couldn't buy a travel ticket anymore on, for instance, the fast train or the the express bus that goes somewhere that she wanted to go. And there are a lot of express trains in China. They're pretty cool. But if your social credit score drops below a certain level, you no longer have access to high-speed travel. Now, you can go on the slow train that stops at every little, burg and on the way. You'll take maybe days to get there when fast travel will get you there in a few hours. But this kind of automatic control it doesn't require a political system in place. There's really nobody you can go and complain to anyway. You're subject to it. If the algorithm says you have violated, then you have violated and you have no recourse. Part of the problem with this, by the way, is that many people are being unfairly, for one reason or another, bad data, misread data, mistakes in just the algorithm, have actually punished people that have done nothing wrong at all. They're otherwise model citizens of China. But because, something happened along the way and the system didn't work the way it was supposed to, they got punished right along with everybody else.
Yeah, it's shocking. And I've heard that even if you associate with somebody whose credit score goes down, yours can go down as well. So there's a sort of an encouragement to isolate and ostracize the person who's deemed by the state or by the technocrats to be stepping out of line. This is really shocking stuff that I think people need to be aware of. This is technocracy. But maybe we can shift into, science versus scientism, Patrick, because technocracy obviously wears the clothes of science. It likes to dress itself up as the scientific solution. But is this really the case? And I suspect not. Can you tell us a little bit about the claims of scientism? And we already know that it's based on a bogus claim with carbon dioxide and the climate. And I would add that there are many factors to do with the current health situation that's going around the globe that are similarly dubious and questionable. And the facts of reality can be consulted to see that there's a great big dupe going on. So what can you tell us about scientism and the basis, in fact, of any of this technocracy?
Exactly. Both technocracy and transhumanism claim their roots in the doctrine of scientism. This goes back, philosophically, goes back a long ways, in particular to the early 1800s with a French philosopher by the name of Henri de Saint-Simon. And Saint-Simon was kind of a radical philosopher for his time because he excoriated religion of the day, especially the Catholic Church, but he excoriated religion and said religion does not take care of the needs of the people. And that it had failed. And what was just coming in as technology, as the advancement of science, he believed that science was the answer to humanity's needs. So he said, we need to create a new religion, he called it a new Christianity. It had nothing to do with Christianity, but he called it a new Christianity. He wrote papers on it and fleshed out the doctrine. And he said, relating to scientism, he said, that scientists and engineers are the ones that need to run society. In other words, science was elevated to a position of godhood, and the scientists and engineers would be the priests of that godhood. And he actually used that term, priests, for the scientists and engineers and technicians. His number one disciple, Auguste Comte, became the father of the social sciences today throughout the world in universities. And so these people, the two of them, had tremendous influence, in thinking across the whole Western world. But science was elevated to a state of godhood, infallibility. And Saint Simon said that no truth could be discovered outside of science. So it rejects philosophy altogether. It rejects the study of ethics. It rejects biblical Christianity, for instance, which has a book that claims to contain truth. So moral truth and things like that are unprovable and therefore unscientific, and so it's just discarded. The whole thing is discarded.
That seems a bit crazy, doesn't it? Because philosophy is actually the mother of all sciences. You could argue philosophy and our basic worldview is what science rests on. You could argue, but yes, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you at the point.
Right. Here's where it went wrong, I think, from the very get-go. Real science, observational science, I have great respect for, always have. I love it. But throughout history, known history of mankind, there have been eras when various types of idols were created for people to worship. There was golden idols, there was wooden idols, there was carved idols, there was, anything from totem poles, you name it. Man has always found a way to worship something that he creates with his own hands, right? And, we can look back historically and kind of chuckle at some of the stuff that people had worshiped, but it wasn't funny at the time. And today, this so-called science that they're worshiping is a creation of their own hands and has nothing to do with real science. It's a phony science. It's a pseudoscience that they call science. They say it's infallible. They say they are the priesthood that has not the collar and like the Anglicans or the Catholics wear, but they have on the white coats with the pencils in their pocket and the stethoscope around their, the priesthood today looks different.
Yeah. But it seems to me, Patrick, that they're, like I mentioned at the beginning, that they kind of pinched science's clothes. And they're wearing them as a sort of a propagandist's tool. It seems to me that what we're seeing is just a bunch of liars, a bunch of people spinning yarns and propaganda, albeit with colossal budgets and vast networks of secret societies with which to do this, huge resources. But it seems like a fundamental dupe to be claiming the things that are claimed in the name of science. Now, I mean, maybe we can go into transhumanism in a little more detail, but there are also things like eugenics. I think that they're keen to reduce the number of people on the planet as well, and these other sort of artificial intelligence. There seems to be an underlying sort of mystical belief that whatever they want, they can have. Whatever we say is true is true. They whether it be a supreme arrogance or wishful thinking, or maybe a blend of all of those. I mean, they patently seem to be wrong. But the central point to me that I observe is that this scientism is anything but science, and it seems tragic when people see these claims. Everyone's heard, we're following the science on the TV to do with the alleged pandemic. Everyone's following the science, it seems. But, you can be sure that they're not actually following science, because there are plenty of other people that are uncovering facts that contradict them. So we've got this complex web, haven't we, where science is being misrepresented. Would you think that's fair to say?
Well, it is, and well, I would just say real science is getting trashed in the process. Many people are throwing the baby out with the bathwater, unfairly so, because these scientism people are not presenting real science at all. It's just they're dreaming up things for you to do based on their view. They're on some metaphysical philosophy that you should do, and then telling you should do it in the name of science. It's absolutely illogical. It's irrelevant. I mean, it's just there's no sense to it whatsoever. No common sense. Nothing.
It does seem particularly tragic because as we've kind of hinted at already, science has a proper science. I mean, I consider science not any particular body of knowledge, but a method. Its scientific method is reason, evidence. It's generating hypotheses and then testing them, etc., etc. Genuine science is a method, is a rational method. And it seems tragic because that rational method of genuine science has brought us, the means to have this conversation. Our computers, cars, airplanes, all of this, our dishwashers. It is that scientific method that's brought us all these good things, and it seems particularly tragic to me that it's now being rubbished and so seriously misrepresented, because there's the tendency for people to think, oh yes, science, it's great, I love science and all these amazing new toys we have, therefore technocracy must be good. And this seems a tragic association that needs to be broken, doesn't it, in the minds of people, would you say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, they're using all of the pleasure things that we might get from science to club us to death in the name of their pseudoscience.
So, how does transhumanism tie in with the technocracy, Patrick?
Well, the two are joined at the hip, as far as I'm concerned, like Siamese twins. They work together. They're very closely related ideologically, as we already said, through scientism. They both look at science in the same way. The technocrats look at science, their pseudoscience, to transform society into Society 2.0. The transhuman crowd in particular looks to technology and science to transform the human condition directly. In other words, if you're going to create a Society 2.0, you need humans 2.0 to live there. And we say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means the genetic engineering or re-engineering of people, of humanity in general, in their minds, to take control over the process of evolution, to use science to speed it up. Hey, let's just get to the quick of the matter. Let's just go do what we think we ought to do. So the transhuman movement in the world today is huge. It is spread quietly, pretty much unnoticed throughout universities all around the world. And it is now bringing this technology to bear on the human condition through these mandated vaccines. The pandemic, of course, started it, and probably the virus was itself was part of the mechanism here. But the vaccines, when they came along, these new types of gene therapy vaccines, unproven still and not even authorized for use, is on emergency use authorization, mostly in America and around the world. They're sticking these needles into people's arms all over the planet to get a conduit into the genetic structure of humanity. And they're insisting it must be 100% of the people everywhere. In America, in Australia, and Great Britain, everywhere is always the same. 100%, everyone must get vaccinated or else. And, the or else isn't too friendly these days either, as in Australia, where they're shooting rubber bullets and tear gas and beating people up and dragging them off by the hair. It's absolutely insane. But this is the mindset of these transhumanists at the top. They want to get control over people's DNA. And as outrageous as that sounds, to many people who have never heard this before, we need to go back to 1992 again, to the United Nations and Agenda 21. That was the agenda for the 21st century. And indeed, they sort of conjured up sustainable development as being the next big thing. Sustainable development, by the way, was a singular product designed by Gru Harlem Brundtland, who chaired the so-called Brundtland Commission that the United Nations sponsored to cook up this whole sustainable development thing. She produced a book from her commission that terminated in 1987 called Our Common Future. It's still on the market. You can still buy that book today. I encourage people to do it. If they don't believe me, they can go read it for themselves. But this was where sustainable development was codified. This was the architectural book of that decade that said, this is what it's going to look like. This is what it's going to be. And so Brundtland set the policy for 1992 when Agenda 21 was finally codified itself and released on the world. Well, what most people don't know is that Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the former prime minister, by the way, of Norway, and she was the minister of the environment there for a stay also, but Brundtland was a member of the Trilateral Commission almost from the get-go. She was one of those master elite oligarchs, if you will, architecting the new international economic order, and she set the policy that the United Nations took and ran with from 1992 onwards, okay? So let me set that aside for just a minute. The real conference was sponsored by a UN organization called UNCED. That's the UN Conference on Economic Development, UNCED. So UNCED was running in Rio de Janeiro to produce Agenda 21. At the same time, in parallel with the UNCED conference, was the Biodiversity Treaty it wasn't one and the same, but they were running in parallel because the Biodiversity Treaty would further flesh out the details of what it meant to society in order for Agenda 21 to take place. It was a huge doctrine. Most people never paid attention to it, but I have the book here. It's like 1,250 pages. If you drop it, you break your toe. It's really heavy. And so the Biodiversity Agreement was signed off on by all nations at the same time that they signed off on the Agenda 21 doctrine. Okay, they went hand in hand together. During the biodiversity track, it was revealed that the main drivers of biodiversity had redefined what biodiversity meant. Now, to you and me, that means, well, there's species in the jungle, and there's birds in the trees, and there's lizards on the ground, and snakes, and we like all that nature stuff, right? We want to protect, we don't want to see species getting wiped out on planet Earth, whatever. These people back then that were driving this process believed and saw that genetic engineering was the future of the world, and they were the ones that redefined the term biodiversity to mean genetic manipulation. And they were very open about it. And you say, well, who were the actors? Who were the stakeholders that were in there? Well, big pharma companies were huge drivers. The the emerging, what they call the emerging biotechnology companies and industry were big players back then. And they codified this into the Biodiversity Treaty that the future of the world rested on genetic modification of DNA everywhere. Now, just to give us a little bit of credence to that, think about how Monsanto has modified almost every seed that they, food seed anyway, they get their hands on. Think about the animals that have been genetically engineered for all kinds of things, whether it would be, producing more muscle or being of a different size or whatever. Think about all the insects that have been genetically modified for various purposes. And think about all the fish that have been genetically modified so they could grow twice as fast in fish farms to create more fish for people to eat. Over the last 40 years or 35 years, genetic engineering has taken over other than humans, has taken over every other branch of the zoological tree that you can think of. It's all been conquered. The last frontier. I am thinking of Star Trek, the final frontier, and the music plays and all that. The final frontier for these genetic manipulation whack jobs is humans. And they're going for the humans at breakneck speed. And if anybody just studies the historical track leading up to this, you cannot come to any other conclusion. There is no other conclusion that you can come to. These people want to hijack the human genome that they think they understand and can do better than we have ever done in history. And, here's where we see this whole concept of science as God. For those who believe in creation and believe in a creator who created man and created the genome, etc., or there's another crowd that believes in evolution that just happened by chance. Well, in either case, these scientists and engineers, genetic scientists and engineers today, believe that they can do a better job of designing our genetic future than anything that came before it. If it was God that did it, we can beat God hands down. If it was evolution that did it, we're hijacking evolution. We're going to speed it up by a few million years, and we're going to get right to the quick of whatever we want humans 2.0 to look like. So they're recreating, in their mind, they're recreating mankind and the system we live in according to what they see as good in their own eyes. That's the problem. It's good in their eyes, nobody else's.
Yeah, in their deluded eyes, I would say. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really, really alarming stuff, and people should know this. Anyone who still hasn't had their double experimental treatment needs to really think carefully before they do so. But did coming back to your original point about Brundtland and her book setting out this resource-based economy that is going to be imposed on us. I haven't read the book. Has she fleshed out? I mean, what would a resource-based economy look like? I mean, I've heard Peter Joseph talking about it, the leader of the Zeitgeist movement. He talks about bringing in a resource-based economy. Is he talking about the same thing that Brundtland was? And if so, can you describe it? Can you put some flesh on that idea for us?
Yes, he does, and he did, and all of the Zeitgeist movement, which started before Peter Joseph, but he got into it, kind of became the spokesman for it. That's all pure, in my opinion, pure technocracy that was just kind of fantasized from the original the original documents. In other words, they gave they took the artwork, they took the design, they actually showed people things what it would look like. The original technocrats never did that. They just said this is the requirements, this is the structure of how we're going to build it, framework. The Zeitgeist movement had some really cool science fiction-y type, rationale and pictures and designs and architecture and stuff that said, well, this is what it could look like. And but it was still technocracy in the end of it. It was just still the same thing. And we saw the name change, by the way, from technocracy in 1992. The name got changed to sustainable development. It was not a substantive change in terms of content. They changed the name because people would be more likely to accept sustainable development. It's a great marketing name. Well, you want to be sustainable, don't you? Don't you want to last? Who would say no? Of course you want to last. Well, are you against development? You don't want to see any progress in development? Well, of course, everybody wants that. Sustainable development is the perfect marketing name for this because nobody could refuse it. In America, when American politicians tried to float the concept of Agenda 21, they were immediately pushed back into the gutter. Americans would have nothing to do with Agenda 21. You said, we don't like agendas here. Don't give us no stinking agenda. And so they went to the drawing boards. They created a bunch of focus groups to talk this out. And they came up in America with a great new marketing term in America that would allow them to get Agenda 21 into American society. And they call another brilliant name. They called it smart growth. Well, you don't want dumb growth, do you? Oh, well, no, I don't want dumb growth, man. I don't want my city to be dumb. Of course, I want it to be smart. Well, are you anti-growth? You don't want to see anything grow in your country? Well, no, I want to see everything grow. Well, you must be for smart growth, right? Well, and of course, everybody just accepts that. It was a great marketing name. We've done this historically on purpose. It's a policy that's been implemented in various, continents around the world, whatever it took to get that people group to accept the underlying tenets of sustainable development, they would do it at the drop of a hat.
Yeah, it's amazing the role of spin, propaganda, public relations, ever since Edward Bernays wrote his very good book, Propaganda, back in 1928, I think. It's come a long way, hasn't it? The art of persuading people onto an idea, even without their conscious awareness of it, has been perfected. But this economic system of resource-based, are we talking energy allocations? People say it's, the sustainable thing has to be to do with energy. Are we talking about everybody having a carbon credit energy allocation and sort of paying for things on account of how much energy it costs to produce them? Are we heading to something like that that's totally regimented, where the idea of sort of working extra hard, earning a bit more and being extravagant is going to be out of the question? Is everyone going to be capped with a certain spend limit? How will it work?
This is absolutely on the drawing board right now. It's being implemented in many places around the country, around the world. The idea of energy credits or carbon credits, because carbon is viewed as energy, right? This was written down in very clear detail back in the 1930s by the original technocrats. They wanted to they wanted to get rid of money. They believed money was absolutely the wrong accounting system for a technocracy. That's a resource-based system. So they said the only constant that can be used to regulate a technocracy is energy. So all the focus was put on energy. And what they propose, and it does make some sense on the surface of it, because all productivity requires energy.
Absolutely. We all need energy for everything.
You do, unless you're just walking by yourself out in the woods and you have one people power and you're walking along, but sooner or later you're going to have to eat or you're going to run out of energy and die before you get back home. Energy was the only accounting system that they could see as being right for a resource-based system, because it would control automatically all inputs and all outputs. So they proposed an energy credit back in the 30s, and it would work like this. At the beginning, they would make a forecast of the energy to be produced at the beginning of a period, say a quarter. And whatever that forecast would be, they would then take the number of people in that system, the population, and they would simply divide the larger amount by the population to figure out how many energy credits each person could have. And they would send out a script. They intended to send out a script, an energy script, to everybody to use as money to buy things. In particular, to buy things, not to sell things, because you wouldn't own anything. They owned everything. You were intended to be basically, have nothing. Reminds you of the World Economic Forum today, doesn't it? You will own nothing and be happy. Yeah, it does. So here's the thing with energy credits. At the beginning of the period, you get your script, and you would go out and buy goods and services in the stores and grocery store based on the amount of energy that went in to produce those goods and services. They figured that science could make those calculations for you. So they know what energy, for instance, it took to make a shirt or to grow a banana or whatever. And you would cough up energy script for those products according to the energy that went into them. At the end of the period, let's say it's a quarter, and you still got 2 weeks to go before your period is over. You could look forward to getting a new allocation on the first of the month as they made the new forecast, right? It might be higher, it might be lower, but whatever, they were going to just forecast what is. Well, let's say you ran out of energy scripts and there was 2 weeks to go. Too bad. You'd have to either just tighten your belt or borrow some, try and go out and beg somebody else to give you some of their energy scripts so that you could live. But you basically would be shut down. So you take care of it and you come to the end of the month. Let's say at the end of the period, or the period, that you have, say, 100 energy credits left over. And you're all proud of yourself because you were frugal, you budgeted, and you have 100 energy credits left over. And you're thinking to yourself, I'm going to put these under the mattress and I'm going to save them up because I'm going to buy something really special 2 or 3 months down the road. Sorry. Your energy credits all expire just before the new allocation is in your hand. So there's no way to save. There's no way to build up any assets to leave to your children or your grandchildren. You're living at the instance of the technate, the controllers. Yeah. Now, you say, that sounds pretty draconian. I actually published pictures that I discovered of these energy scripts as they designed them in the 1930s. They really meant it. Today, all of this stuff we see, I don't care where it is, whether you see it as cap and trade, whether you see it as just an energy, a carbon footprint calculator. There's several of them on the internet right now that will calculate your carbon footprint. And I just read in Sweden that there's a bank in Sweden right now, and is working with another company there, that they have credit cards where you buy stuff in the store with credit cards, that they have, they've matched up an application to the credit card that for every purchase that you make, it will, before you make the purchase, it will automatically present you with your current carbon footprint. That will either encourage you or discourage you from making that purchase. And you say, well, what could be so bad about that? Well, let me tell you, what's bad about that, you don't give them any information to calculate that. They go through back channels and discover everything there is to know about you to come up with whether or not your carbon footprint is too high, according to their view of what you should be.
Yeah, the thing that strikes me about such a system, indeed technocracy, as a whole, the whole concept of it, is that it's not something that these I think of them as the parasite class. You know, these people that are up there have grabbed the wealth, who have hijacked governments and so forth. It's not as though they want to go and try this system out and do that for themselves, like a bunch of people might go out and live on an island somewhere and say, just leave us alone, we want to live like this. You know, good luck to them. That would be fine, wouldn't it? It strikes me as being a system that's very, very much, and very obviously so, designed to be imposed on others. In fact, I imagine these technocrats would probably be, you know, above this system. They'd be looking down on it, of course, and probably not subject to it at all. So it seems very disingenuous, doesn't it? It's not as though the technocrats are out there doing this resource-based economy somewhere and it's working wonderfully and they're inviting us all to join in. It's very much about control, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. See, they're the controllers. They're the engineers. They're exempt from anything they're telling everybody else to do.
Yeah.
It smacks of hypocrisy. I think people are catching on pretty quickly. In America here, even as our President Biden declared that any company over 100 employees would be required to mandate vaccinations for all of their employees, bar none, even as all of society is impacted by this crazy mandate that he said he's going to, enforce, and it's really already happening. All the workers in Washington, White House staff, the interns, Congress itself, they're all exempt. They have exempted themselves from the mandate. What does this tell you?
Yeah. It speaks
Meanwhile, and I say meanwhile, in New York State, I just posted the story on Technocracy News today. In New York State, nurses and doctors and health professionals are refusing to take the vaccine because they know it's dangerous. And everybody should have an informed choice on it. I'm not saying that it's universally evil. If you want to have a vaccine, be my guest. If you want to take drugs, I don't care. It's your problem, not mine. But as these people shake out of the medical system in New York State, it's bad enough that they would lose their job because they don't want to get vaccinated, but doctors and nurses are being fired right now as we speak in New York State. They're being fired because they do not comply and will not comply with the vaccine mandate that the hospitals have put on them. It's the hospitals that have put on the mandate on the people. So as they are fired, kicked out the door, New York State has just ruled in the employment department, I forget the name of it, but it's the state control over all employment policy, that if you are fired because you have refused a mandate from your employer, you will not be able to collect unemployment benefits. Nigel, they're crushing people. Some of these highly skilled nurses that were heroes last year for helping people get better, and they weren't complicit in all the medical, what drugs and stuff were given. They cared for the people. The heroes of yesteryear are being thrown out in the street, and I can guarantee you that many of those people, within a period probably of a few weeks or a month, will be homeless, living on the street because they can't even get the safety net income to get them through to the next job. This is tyranny at its worst, and it's going to get worse if it's not checked right now. And I know in Great Britain, I know you would probably tell 100 stories like that where people have been crushed by some political process.
There have been a lot of medical people losing their jobs and sort of getting excommunicated from the medical profession. It hasn't quite got as bad as it is as you're describing there in the States just yet, but I'm sure that is just around the corner here as well. one of the things I wanted to ask you is do you see this the technocracy as we're seeing it, and as in this conversation we've described, this sort of monster rising up into visibility from perhaps back in the 80s and 90s where it didn't look like there was anything to be concerned about. Do you see this as an ongoing development that just happened to sort of come at a time, obviously, when technology can facilitate it? Obviously, a lot of the surveillance and stuff needed the internet and everything to come to pass before that could happen. Do you see this as an extension of the control, for example, of the financial control? Because the money creation has been in the bag for some time. I mean, G. Edward Griffin has written about the creation of the Federal Reserve. I assume that you're familiar with that. The concept of central banks, the English central bank, for goodness sake, 1694. It's been around a long time, that the idea of money creation and essentially steering society. So do you see this very obvious form of an open tyranny and control as simply a manifestation of an age-old situation, if you like, or do you see it as more of a modern phenomena?
Well, it is more modern in this sense. And I think it was articulated by a member of the Trilateral Commission, a scholar back in 1974, that complained that the old-fashioned frontal assault was unsuccessful at getting what they wanted. And there had been some frontal assaults, conspiracies, for instance, to overthrow the U.S. government. And there's been global conspiracies of that sort, monetary conspiracies that have been busted before. And they said, we need a new strategy. We need something that's going to what they called back then an end run around national sovereignty. This has been their MO ever since, to get what they want by stealth, by death of 1,000 cuts. And it's resulted in tyranny. I think they knew that from the beginning, because Brzezinski had no problem working with communist Chinese. He thought it was great. It was a scorched, they had a scorched earth nation where they could build back better. And they did. That's what they built back better. Tyranny, and the underlying nature of this is pure tyranny. Tyranny never, ever retreats on its own. It never has in history, and it never will in the future. That's the nature of tyranny. Tyranny can only be halted when it is forcefully rejected and resisted. That's the only way. You can think back to World War II, that Neville Chamberlain had the idea that if he appeased Hitler, why, Hitler would turn into he would pull his punches, he would turn into a nice guy, and he would quit all his conquering of nations in Europe. It didn't work. It famously didn't work, because you cannot appease a tyrannical force. At that point, it was only Hitler that happened to be sitting in the captain's seat, but it doesn't matter who sits in the captain's seat. Tyranny is tyranny. It's in the heart of man, some men, not all, so to rise up and execute their will over everybody else's will. And we've seen it in every single industry in the last 200 or 300 years. We can look at any industry you want to see people like that, that had in mind to execute tyranny over people. This is where we are today. It's not going to recede unless people forcefully rise up and throw the bums out.
Yeah, so it really does come down to an issue of freedom, doesn't it? Do we want to be kicked around and told what to do, or do we want to stand up and be free individuals? So where can we go? I mean, obviously we've painted quite a grim picture. It is an alarming situation, and people need to fully clock how urgent and how dangerous it really is. I mean, I don't think it can be overstated, and I'm sure you'll agree. But what do you say to those that are looking for a solution? I mean, you've obviously just said we've got to stand up and not take it. Can you be more specific for people that might want to see a concrete example of that?
Well, it's probably structurally going to be a little bit different than in a country outside of America. But in our country, given our constitutional framework that we have in our country, we still have a lot of latitude, for instance, as relates to free speech, freedom of the press, stuff like that. It's all under attack, don't get me wrong. But free speech is pretty much a universal concept. People in every country that I've communicated with in the last few years understand that free speech is just a basic human right. And you have a right to express your ideas, crazy as they might be. Other people don't have to listen. They can reject you, whatever, if they want. But free speech is the issue right now, and we see censorship everywhere. This is the big thing. The propaganda machine has forcefully ejected all of the alternative narrative from, reaching people's ears all around the world. It's not just American, it's not just English, Britain's issue, it's everywhere. And at this point, the only counter against this narrative, for those who understand the truth more clearly, they must speak up. They must speak up. Even at the threat of being excommunicated by your own family, you must speak up and speak the truth. I would say, don't be a jerk. On the other hand, don't just shout at people and yell at them. That won't get you anywhere. But you've got to learn how to be a persuader and start, getting people involved with the right side of history on this. Get that they're deceived, they're deluded, they're saturated with this propaganda. You've got to pull them out as if they were operating in the worst, most insidious cult you've ever heard of in your life. You must rescue them and bring them out into the daylight again, to where they can be effective to push back. I think the free speech debate is going to be one of the most important issues of our time that we have to deal with, because if we cannot maintain any semblance of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, we're basically going to have to declare ourselves to be doomed for a period of time. Every revolution in history, Bolshevik Revolution, German Revolution, even in China, you could go into Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, all the revolutions started with one singular assault, and that was on the free media, on the free press. They would take over the newspapers, the newsletters, the popular speakers. They would take over the TV stations, the radio stations, and oftentimes drag them out and shoot them in the street, and they put the propaganda machine in there. This attacks on citizen speech has always been at the forefront of every single revolution in history, in my opinion. I've researched a lot. We're dealing with these attacks right now. We can see that free speech and freedom of the press is being shut down everywhere in the world. We can't let it happen, Nigel. We just cannot let it happen. We must keep the channels of communication open so that we can communicate, get truth to people who need it, and get coordination to people who are resisting.
Yeah, I mean, free speech, famously the barometer of political freedom or enslavement. It is on the attack here, people getting wiped off YouTube accounts and so forth. It's very alarming to see. I mean, I would advocate, I agree totally with you that we must keep the conversations going. We must try to even in some respects, it seems against all the odds that it can be done, but we have to try to talk to our friends and neighbours and relations to try and rationally persuade them. It does seem to me that the vast majority of people can't entertain rational arguments over and above the sort of appeal to authority and the appeal to majority. I talk to a lot of people who, lawyers and business owners and doctor friends who are what I would consider in the matrix, to the extent that they can't grasp that the BBC is lying to them, and the BBC just being a metaphor for mainstream narrative. They can't grasp that technocracy, it can't be a problem because it's not on the news, I do get exasperated as to how to reach these people who seem to cling to, well, everybody else thinks this, therefore, I dare not have a different opinion. but I do agree that we just have to keep trying to reach out, trying to persuade, trying to share the information. And a massive thank you to you, Patrick, for your all your efforts, the books you've put out. I must confess I haven't read them yet, but I certainly intend to. For putting this conversation out there. It couldn't be a more important dot joining exercise to see this current context that we're in, seeing it. All of what you're saying seems to be coming to fruition.
Unfortunately, it has, and much to my surprise, almost 50% of the visitor traffic that we receive at technocracy.news is from overseas. In other words, it does not originate in the United States.
Yeah.
So people around the world are waking up to what's going on. They want to read about it. It's also kind of weird that technocracy.news is the only website on the internet still that deals exclusively with technocracy, and has since, I don't know, we're 7 years into this now. And so, people want to know about technocracy. They come to technocracy.news. I would encourage any of your listeners that are not in the United States, don't try to procure a book from our website in America, which is in America, right? We'd have to ship from America. It's way too expensive, and now there's new customs rules and duties and whatever. We just cannot go through that to get books delivered to a European or to Great Britain or Australia or New Zealand. We tell people just go to your local book distributors. There's several online, and there's also just bookstores that are plugged into this distribution. Our books on technocracy are available pretty much everywhere in your local markets. You may have to snoop around to find them a little bit, but I don't know what your book chains are, if you have some big chains in Britain, but you'll find the book if you go look for it. You can find the titles, and you could read the reviews and stuff on Amazon. I think they have a bunch of reviews. So does Barnes and Noble, and get an idea whether you want to buy the book in the first place. I think you will if you got a few bucks. It's one of the best investments you make. But we have to get this information out. That's the thing. It's sad when somebody writes a book about Marxism or communism, it'll become a bestseller overnight. It's like, but my books on technocracy, even though we've sold some over the years, I'm not saying we haven't, but it's absolutely nowhere near that status, where we can say, well, I sold, 500,000 books last year. It's never happened. It probably won't. No. This information is a little bit maybe too heady for some people, that they just don't want to think that hard. I don't know. Yeah. My co-author, Anthony Sutton, was a Brit. I don't know if you knew that.
No, I didn't know.
Back in the 70s, he was the professor of economics at UCLA and then at Stanford University. And Tony had a very dry sense of humor, which I came to realize that's kind of a British thing. He had a very dry sense of humor. But he would say occasionally when he got up to speak, he would start out his speech by just setting the groundwork for, okay, where are you people out there? And he would say 2% of the people think, 8% think they think, and 90% would rather die than think. Where are you? Yeah, this is what we're faced with today. It's still the same. 2% think, 8% think they think, and the 90% would rather die than think. And you can't do anything with the 90%. You just can't. You can appeal to the 2%. They're easy. You can appeal to the 8% who at least they think they're thinking. Maybe you can get into their head and help them out into the 2%. But I've never forgotten that. I don't know where he got it.
Yeah, I mean, thinking skills is kind of my main gig, really, and the lack of them, we should say, and that really is somewhere where I try and focus. But unfortunately, due to decades of woefully inadequate education and a general sort of malaise and disinterested in really knowing what's going on, frankly. Most people just want to be entertained into oblivion. It's very, very difficult to encourage people to think, but that's another conversation. Patrick, did you want to mention your free speech organisation that you've started for the benefit of any American listeners, particularly, just as one extra addition?
Sure. Yeah, we did. In 2018, I started Citizens for Free Speech, primarily for America to defend and support the First Amendment of our Constitution. It's ironic in America that we need to have an organization to defend free speech. It's like just an oxymoron. What? But we've hit a nerve, and we've had just thousands and thousands of people come to us and continue to flow in every day to say, "Man, I'm on board, man. I want to be part of this." So, we have a lot of good stuff we've been doing for Americans. In particular, we're offering training classes on how to communicate in the civil arena. We have collateral that we're offering to our members here. We can't ship outside of the United States right now. I think we're doing some stuff to Canada, but we simply can't go overseas with any of our collateral. But we have a lot of free graphics available as well that people can go to. And of course, our webinars and our electronic meetings that we do, we often have a number of people that come in from overseas. We did a training session on our kind of signature training program. It's called Citizen Ninja Stand Up to Power. And we did this live online training. Our director of training conducted the training based on her book by the same name. And lo and behold, we found out that we had a student from India who was attending. He spoke very good English, but I can't remember the city he said he was from. It absolutely blew us away. He was interested in learning the principles of free speech and how to communicate with people, how to persuade people with ideas and stuff like that. Yeah. And it's just like, on one hand, it just kind of touched your heart. On the other hand, it's just stunning that somebody all the way from India, halfway around the world, would come to America, to little old Citizens for Free Speech, to hear one of our training series. So we're doing as much as we can. Free speech is universal. I believe it's a universal human right. I think people know intuitively, whatever country they're from, they know that this is a basic human right. And when they are denied their ability to speak, they feel bad. Yeah. And, they feel oppressed. So, for whatever people can get out of it, go for it.
Excellent.
For freespeech.org, by the way.
Thank you so much, Patrick. For that, obviously, Technocracy News and Trends. The website, just remind us again, the website, is it technocracynews.com?
It's just technocracy.news. Yeah, you can get on the newsletter there. They get a daily digest of articles that I post. I try not to overload people, but as I survey the world press, my goal is to pick out a solid 3 stories a day that paints the picture of global technocracy. That's what it's all about. Yeah. I could probably spend the entire day posting stories, but it would overload everybody. There's no point. Yeah. This is kind of like a journalistic effort to, paint paint by the numbers picture or something to get people to understand the nature of technocracy and how it's coming on us. So I pick stories that I post very carefully. That will express that story correctly and accurately to people. Yep.
I think it's a wonderful resource. I've been signed up to your newsletter for some time now, well over a year, and I think it's a fantastic resource, and very grateful to you informing me, and I'd recommend all my listeners to sign up to it as well. Patrick, thank you so much for sharing all your insights on this ever so important topic. I do hope people treat it with the give it the attention and the seriousness that it really deserves. And thank you for all of your work, past, present, and so forth, and obviously for your time here today. So many, many thanks on behalf of the listeners and me for your time.
I appreciate it. And, I just have to say to all the people of the world, this is trite we're in it together, and we have to fight it together.
And thank you all for listening. I do hope you've got some value from this. As always, please do check out the website, lawfulrebel.com. All links will be below this and on the show notes for this podcast. And I do hope you'll all join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be